Growing up, I learned that love wasn't something you could rely on. It wasn't something you could even expect. In my house, love was a commodity, and I was never quite sure if I could afford it. My parents, two people who, by all appearances, should have been the ones to teach me what love was, were emotionally absent. I wasn't the kid they'd dote on, and I wasn't the child they'd show affection toward. They never gave me the assurance that I mattered. From the outside, we looked like a typical family. We had a house in the suburbs, a couple of cars, and the necessary things to look like we had it all. But behind closed doors, the atmosphere was different. I would sit in my room, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, watching the clock tick away. My parents were either too busy with work or too wrapped up in their own world to notice I was there or to care. It was never about neglect. Not in the way that some people experience neglect. No, my parents were good enough at being there physically. But emotionally, they might as well have been miles away. My father worked long hours. And when he came home, he didn't talk much. He wasn't mean, but he wasn't warm either. He was distant in a way that suggested I didn't really matter. And my mother, well, she was much the same. She was often caught up in her own issues, her own battles with self-esteem, and whatever turmoil she had in her life. She never made me feel like I was a priority. There were moments that I thought maybe, just maybe, things would change. Maybe they'd see me as someone who mattered. Maybe they'd care. But the moments were fleeting. I'd ask for help with my homework, and they'd be too tired. I'd try to share something that excited me, a new book I was reading, a project I was working on, but it seemed to fall on deaf ears. When I'd get a good grade, it wasn't met with enthusiasm or even a congratulatory word. It was just expected. There was no joy in their eyes when they looked at me. As I grew older, I learned not to expect anything more. The rare attempts at emotional connection, if you could call them that, only left me feeling more empty. I started thinking that something was wrong with me. Was I not worth their time? Was I not worth loving? I didn't have the answers, but I had a sinking feeling that my parents didn't have the capacity to give me what I needed. It's funny, you can be surrounded by people, family, classmates, friends, and still feel completely alone. And that's how I felt. Alone, in a crowd, and even more so in my own home. I couldn't even pinpoint when the loneliness started. Maybe it was always there, lingering like an unnoticed shadow. I remember the long weekends when I'd be left to my own devices. My parents were out doing whatever they did, and I was stuck at home. There was no one to talk to, no one to confide in. My room became my only refuge, and I filled the hours with whatever I could: books, video games, sketching, anything to drown out the silence. But nothing ever seemed to fill the void. There were times when I would try to get their attention talking about a new hobby, asking them to watch a movie with me, but it was always met with half-hearted responses or a hurried dismissal. My mother would smile faintly, but her eyes never really met mine. My father would grunt an acknowledgement, but his focus was always on something else. I began to realize that no matter how hard I tried to reach out, the result was always the same. I was alone in a house full of people. And it wasn't just about the moments when I wanted affection. It was the absence of those small, everyday moments that really hurt. A hug after a tough day. How are you? That wasn't just a formality. I couldn't remember the last time either of my parents held me close or expressed even a flicker of concern over my well-being. They were emotionally unavailable, and I had learned to adjust to that coldness. But what made it worse was that I didn't have anyone else. The few friends I made during school didn't fill the gap. They had their own families, their own lives, and their own love to give. So I kept my emotions inside, buried them deep where no one could see. I became an expert at hiding my pain behind a facade of indifference. But inside, it was like a slow-burning fire. I was starving for something I could never have: love. It wasn't until I left for college that I truly began to understand what it meant to be free from the emotional weight of my family. I left behind the house, the walls that had been silent witnesses to years of neglect, and moved into a small dorm room. It was a fresh start. For the first time in years, I wasn't waking up to the muted hum of a household that had no warmth. I could breathe, and I didn't even realize how suffocating my home had been until I was out of it. The constant pressure to be perfect or invisible was gone. I didn't have to pretend to be someone I wasn't anymore. I could just be. I remember the first week in my new dorm, sitting at my desk and staring out the window. The world seemed bigger, the possibilities seemed endless. I could finally start building a life where I wasn't just defined by the lack of affection in my past. I didn't have to live in the shadows of my parents' neglect anymore. But there was something I didn't expect. A strange feeling of emptiness. Even in my newfound freedom, I was finally free, but I was also facing the reality that I had no blueprint for love or connection. I didn't know how to ask for help, how to reach out for support, or even how to form real relationships. Everything I knew was built on the hollow foundation my parents had given me. The first few months were hard. I felt alone again, even in the bustling campus. But at least, for the first time in my life, I was able to choose to be alone. It wasn't the isolation I had endured as a child, it was the solitude of someone learning how to become independent. But I knew, deep down, that I could never go back to the way things were. I didn't realize it at the time, but that was the first step in the journey of discovering who I really was. Without the shadow of my parents hanging over me, it was the beginning of something I hadn't yet understood. I could build my own life. My own future, away from their expectations, away from their indifference. I was always told that success comes from hard work, but no one ever told me how hard it would be to start from nothing. My first job out of college was a typical one, desk job. Cubicles, and that overwhelming feeling that I was just another cog in the machine. The work was unremarkable, but the discomfort of knowing I wasn't pursuing what I truly wanted gnawed at me every day. The dream of having my own business, something that could be mine entirely, was always there, just out of reach. It wasn't as though I hadn't tried. I had. I spent hours online, reading articles, researching, imagining what my business could look like. But it always felt like something was missing. I wasn't sure if I was good enough, if I had the skills to make it work. I wasn't sure if anyone would even care about what I had to offer. And there was always the same voice in the back of my head, telling me I wasn't worthy of success, that I would fail just like I always had before. But I couldn't keep living a life where I wasn't taking risks. I couldn't stay stuck in this cycle of routine, knowing I was capable of more. So, one day, on a particularly sleepless night, I decided to take the plunge. I found a niche, something I was passionate about, an online store that focused on sustainable living products. It wasn't something revolutionary, but it was mine. I had the idea, the passion, and the drive to make it happen. That's when I did it. I took the leap. I quit my stable job. I cashed out what little savings I had and put it all into this idea that had been bouncing around in my head for months. My mind was swirling with excitement and fear, but mostly fear. What if this was a mistake? What if I failed miserably? But there was something about that moment, the uncertainty, the fear, the rush that felt like freedom. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for someone else to decide my future. I was choosing it for myself. The excitement didn't last long. Reality hit hard, and it hit fast. Starting a business wasn't like the movies or the success stories you hear. There were no immediate customers. There were no booming sales. Instead, there were late nights of tinkering with websites, hours spent researching suppliers, and constant self-doubt. Every time I hit a setback, the nagging thought would return. This was a mistake. You're not cut out for this. The first few months were brutal. I poured every cent I had into my business. And still, it felt like nothing was happening. No orders, no growth. It was like I was shouting into an empty void. I was doing everything I was supposed to be doing, posting on social media, trying to get the word out, but the reality was hard to swallow. There was no immediate payoff, and every success felt small. Every email from a potential customer was met with the crushing knowledge that they hadn't actually purchased anything. Every like on a post felt like it came from a stranger who would never follow through. I could feel the weight of failure hanging over me. There were days when I just wanted to give up. The bills piled up, and I watched my savings slip away. There were moments I would wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, wondering if I had made the biggest mistake of my life. I started questioning everything, my decision, my abilities, my worth. But there was one thing I learned in those months: you can't quit. Not when you've given everything. Not when there's nothing left but the burning need to prove that you're capable. So, I kept going, even when the results weren't immediate. I kept building, kept improving. Slowly but surely, I began to see small shifts. The first sale, the first email from a customer who was actually happy with the product, the first positive review. They were small things, but they were enough to keep me going. And that was all I needed, enough to make me believe that just maybe, I could do this. It wasn't sudden, and it wasn't easy, but after months of uncertainty, I began to see the fruits of my labor. A customer returned with a larger order. Another left a glowing review. Slowly, the sales trickled in, And my business began to grow. It wasn't much at first, barely enough to cover my living expenses, but it was something. It was proof that I could build something that mattered. Something that was mine. I remember the first time I realized the business was working. It wasn't just the number of orders or the fact that I was making a profit. It was the realization that I had built this from scratch, with no one else to thank but myself. My parents had never believed in me, and they certainly never taught me how to succeed. But I had done it. I was doing it. I had taken control of my life in a way I never thought was possible. There was a moment when I sat at my desk, late one evening, looking at my computer screen. The orders were still coming in, and I had just hit a new milestone, a record number of sales in a single month. For the first time, I felt like the person I had always wanted to be, not someone dependent on others, not someone defined by my parents' inability to love me, but someone capable of creating their own success. I realized then that it wasn't just about making money. It wasn't just about building a business. It was about proving to myself that I was worthy, that I was capable, and that I could succeed without needing validation from anyone else. That small victory gave me a new sense of purpose. And it was just the beginning. It's funny how people can go years without contacting you, and then suddenly, they reappear out of nowhere, as though nothing has changed. After I started gaining some momentum with my business, I thought I had left my parents behind. Sure, they were still there, somewhere out in the world, but I had finally carved out a life where their opinions didn't matter. Then, one day, the phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but the area code was familiar. My stomach dropped. I didn't want to answer it. I hadn't spoken to my parents in months, years. Even, there was nothing they could say to me that would make a difference. And yet, the pull of that connection, however toxic, was still there. I picked up the phone. "Hello," I said, trying to sound neutral, though my voice betrayed me. "Is this my child?" It was my mother's voice. A sound I hadn't heard in so long, but one that still brought a flood of memories rushing back. I swallowed. "Yes, it's me." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Well, it's been a while, hasn't it?" she said, as if we hadn't been strangers for most of my life. "I've been thinking about you." I couldn't bring myself to say anything. What did she want? Why now? "I've been hearing some things," she continued. "I heard you've been doing quite well. Your little business, it's growing, right?" I felt a knot tighten in my chest. I hadn't told her anything about my business. She had no idea how much I had struggled to get to this point. "I'm doing okay," I replied, not giving her more than what she needed to know. "That's good, very good," she said. "You know, your father and I have been talking. We've been struggling a bit. Things have been tough on our end." A lump formed in my throat. This was the part one had been dreading. I had known it was coming. My parents weren't calling me to reconnect. They were calling because they wanted something. They always did. I tried to keep my voice steady. "I'm sorry to hear that." "Well," she said, her tone shifting, "we've been thinking. You've been doing so well. And we've been going through some tough financial times. Maybe you could help us out. You know, just until we get back on our feet." We wouldn't ask if it wasn't necessary. My heart skipped a beat. The words were casual, but I could hear the desperation beneath them. "I don't have much to spare," I replied, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "I've worked hard for everything I have. And I'm still building my business. It's not easy." "I understand," she said quickly, "but you could help us out. Right, you could make a little donation. We wouldn't need much, just enough to get us through the next few months." Her words sounded rehearsed, like she'd practiced this. It wasn't just a call to check in. It was a call to ask for money. "I really can't right now," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "Things are still tight for me. I'm not in a position to help you." There was a long silence on the other end. I could almost hear her thinking, recalculating. Then she spoke again, her voice softening. "Okay, I understand. But think about it. You're doing well. We've always been here for you. Right, a little help from you wouldn't hurt." The guilt hit me like a wave. She had this way of making me feel like I owed her something. Even though I knew deep down I didn't. I had never asked for this, never asked for a family who couldn't love me properly. Never asked for a life where I was always invisible. I had pulled myself up by my bootstraps, worked tirelessly to get where I was, and now they were trying to pull me back into their web of dependence. I took a deep breath. "I'll think about it," I said, knowing full well I didn't intend to. The calls didn't stop after that. At first, it was just once in a while a call asking if I'd reconsidered helping them. But as my business continued to grow, The calls became more frequent, more insistent. I began to feel like I was being pulled in two directions. On one side, there was my business, something I had fought so hard to build. On the other, there was this ever-present pressure from my parents. It felt like a tug of war, and I was the rope in the middle. My mother would tell me about their mounting bills, the difficulties they were facing. She would speak with a calm urgency, the kind of tone that made it hard to ignore her requests. She didn't come out and ask directly for money every time, but there was a certain implication in every conversation. It was like a silent agreement that I would be the one to bail them out eventually. And when my father joined the conversation, it was even more subtle, but no less manipulative. He would say things like, "We've always supported you," or, "You know, it's your turn to take care of us now." I wanted to scream. They had never taken care of me. They had abandoned me when I needed them the most. And now they were coming back, trying to take what little I had built. I was not their savings account. I was not their fallback plan. But every call, every message, planted a seed of doubt in my mind. What if they were really struggling? What if I should help them? Despite everything, the guilt gnawed at me, pulling at the edges of my resolve. But deep down, I knew what I had to do. I wasn't responsible for their choices. They were the ones who had made a life without emotional connection, without care for their children. They had failed me, and now they were trying to fail me again by taking what I had earned. One afternoon, I received an email from my mother. She'd sent a long message, detailing how much money they needed for an emergency, something about medical bills and repairs to their home. It was all written out in such a way that I could see the calculation, the expectation behind the words. She wasn't just asking for help. She was demanding it. That was the moment I snapped. I'd had enough. My business, my life, my independence, they were all at risk now. And I wasn't about to let my parents take everything from me. Not this time. Not after everything I had been through to get here. I composed my response carefully, knowing this would be the hardest thing I'd ever have to say. "I'm sorry," I wrote. "I can't help you. I've worked hard to build my business from nothing, and I can't afford to give you any more than what I already have. I know this is hard, but I need to look out for myself now." It was the hardest thing I'd ever written, but it was also the most freeing. I had finally drawn the line, and for the first time, I didn't feel guilty. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. I had expected some kind of response after I sent my email, but nothing prepared me for the anger that poured out of my mother. The next call I received was from her, and it was unlike any other conversation we had ever had. Her voice was sharp, accusatory, and full of bitterness. "How dare you?" she spat. "How could you be so selfish? After everything we've done for you, you turn your back on us just like that." I stood frozen, gripping the phone tightly. The words stung, but not in the way I thought they would. I didn't feel guilty. In fact, I felt a sense of relief washing over me. But it was also accompanied by a strange sadness for the woman on the other end of the line who was still trying to manipulate me, who saw me only as a means to an end. "I'm not selfish," I replied, my voice quiet but firm. "I'm looking out for myself for the first time in my life. You never supported me when I needed you. Now, you want me to help you when you've never been there for me. That's not how it works." There was a long silence, and for a moment, I thought the conversation might be over. But then came the cold, almost emotionless reply from my mother. "You'll regret this," she said, her words hanging in the air like a threat. "You'll come crawling back to us. You always do." The line went dead. I stood there, staring at the phone in my hand. I had expected this. It wasn't the first time my mother had tried to manipulate me, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. But this time, something was different. I had stood my ground. I had refused to fall into their trap. And yet, as the silence stretched around me, I couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. Was this really the end of our relationship? Were we truly beyond repair? Over the next few days, I felt like I was fighting a battle on two fronts. On one side was my business, the thing I had worked so hard for, the thing that had kept me going through the darkest times. On the other was this lingering sense of guilt, the echo of my parents' words hanging over me. I had chosen myself over them, and part of me feared I might never be able to shake that feeling. I tried to keep myself busy, throwing myself into my work, trying to ignore the noise in my head. But every time I saw a new email from them or heard their voices in my head, it felt like a reminder that I was alone. Alone in a way that I had never truly understood before. For years, I had depended on the illusion of family, the idea that one day, they would come through for me. But now I saw it clearly. There had never been a family to rely on, just people who saw me as a tool. A resource, a way to get what they needed. And I had let them do it for too long. But the battle was far from over. The emotional weight of cutting him off was immense. And it took everything I had to not give in. Every time the phone rang or I saw a message from them, I had to remind myself that I was doing the right thing. This wasn't just about money, it was about self-respect. About standing up for the life I had built. A week passed, and I thought the storm had settled. But then came the unexpected. One evening, I came home to a letter, an old-fashioned, handwritten one. It was from my father. My stomach twisted as I opened the envelope. Not sure what I would find. His handwriting was messy and rushed. And his words were blunt. I don't know what you're playing at. But we need the money. You're turning your back on family. You'll regret this. You'll see. The letter ended with a request for a specific amount of money. A sum that could wipe out most of my savings. They weren't asking for a loan. They weren't even trying to offer some kind of deal. They were demanding it. Plain and simple. The anger rose within me. Hot and sharp. I'd spent so long resenting my parents for their neglect and manipulation. But the sheer audacity of it was too much. I had cut them off. Told them no, and they were still trying to worm their way back into my life. That night, I called my lawyer. I couldn't afford to wait any longer. My parents' behavior was no longer just a family matter. It was a matter of protecting myself and my future. The lawyer helped me draft a legal response, a clear and concise message stating that I would not be giving him any money. And that any further attempts to demand it would be considered harassment. It wasn't an easy step, but it was necessary. I couldn't let them continue to bully me. When I sent the letter, I felt a strange sense of closure. I had taken the final step in severing those ties. My parents could no longer hold any power over me. Not emotionally, not financially. They had lost that right when they chose not to be there for me when I needed them the most. In the weeks that followed, there was no further communication from them. And as painful as that silence was, it also felt freeing. For the first time, I realized that I didn't need them. I didn't need their approval, their money, or their presence. What I had built was mine. My business was mine. My life was mine. And for the first time, I was the one in control. As I entered the final stretch of the year, my business was thriving. It wasn't easy, and there were still days filled with uncertainty. But I had something that mattered more than the money I had earned. I had my independence. I had my freedom. And while my parents were no longer part of my life in the way they once were, I realized that they had taught me a valuable lesson. They had taught me how to survive on my own, how to stand up for myself, and how to be strong in the face of adversity. It wasn't the love I had once hoped for, but it was a love that came from within. I spent the holidays alone that year, not because I didn't have people who cared, but because I had learned to care for myself in ways I never had before. I had built a life that was my own, one that wasn't dependent on anyone else's approval. And that was more than enough. Looking back now, I realize how far I've come. The struggle, the pain, the sacrifices, they were all part of the journey. And while I may have lost my family, I found something far more valuable in the process, myself. The business continues to grow, but it's not about the money anymore. It's about the freedom to live life on my own terms. It's about knowing that, no matter what, I'm capable of handling whatever comes my way. And, most importantly, it's about finally understanding that I don't need anyone else's love or approval to be whole.